So, welcome. Thank you for joining us for the January 28th special work session here we're at the Ossining Public Library. Please join us for the pledge. So let me just give a little bit of an overview of what to expect for this evening. We have some housekeeping items to do in village government. And the board's going to do our announcements, and then we're going to turn it over to our folks in the village manager's office and corporation council to help walk us through a couple of items that we need to move forward with this week before we get into the really exciting program for this evening, which is to begin exploring green building guidelines here in the village of Ossining. At that time, we'll get to learn more from our very special guests, and we're going to get to hear from everyone in the village who's going to hopefully be part of this process. We're at the very beginning of trying to figure out how we might want to approach this in the village of Ossining. So I'm going to kick us off with our announcements, and I think I only have one this week. How exciting is that? So right back in this room, Thursday, January 29th, starting at 7 p.m., will be the Solarize Ossining Briarcliff launch. Please join us to learn if you have any interest whatsoever in putting solar on your residential or commercial property. Come join us right here in the Vws Theater in the Ossining Public Library at 7 p.m. Thursday, January 29th. If the date has passed and you missed it when you're finally watching this, just go ahead and do a search for Solarize Westchester or Solarize Ossining Briarcliff, and you can learn more about the program and upcoming events as well. Anyone else?
Pull it up here. This Saturday, right here at the Ossining Public Library, there's going to be a suicide awareness and prevention New York tour. You get RSVP. The address is ask@sisfi.org, or you can call 917-651-1889. It's going to be attracting and bringing a lot of parents and youth from all over the county to discuss ways that we could, start a culture and continue a community that addresses that suicide is an epidemic in our community. So I definitely encourage you to join us. And I don't know the times, that maybe someone could shout it out to me. Our mobile shredder will be at the community center on Saturday.
10 to 2.
All right, 10 to 2, our mobile shredder. So all those bills and papers, it's a free service, and it's provided by Westchester County. Thank you.
Thank you. Also, just a quick reminder, on Friday, January 30th, Wabble Cafe is going to be having coffee with a cop. Please join them. They're going to be there from 6 o'clock to 8 o'clock p.m. And that is in 21 Campus Road here in Ossining. I think it will be a great event for you to talk to any issues and concerns. Just an overall of what our village police does for our community.
Thank you. And I will also let everyone in the room know to hold the mic as close as you can, because the sound in the room is, even if we can hear it, it might be tough for them to pick up on the camera, and we want folks at home to be able to hear the full conversation. All right, so with that, shall we move into a very, very quick special session to get through the housekeeping items?
Sure. Sure. I'm going to start with the roll call. The village board. Mayor Garrity.
Present.
Trustee Herrera.
Present.
Trustee Codman.
Present.
And Trustee Casada.
Present.
Okay. And on our agenda this evening, as Mayor mentioned, we are going to talk about green building regulations, but the village manager is going to go over some housekeeping things for this work session.
Thank you. Thank you. Just as a heads up for next week's formal meeting, there will be several items on the agenda which will be added as the week goes by. The first one will be a call for a public hearing. It's an annual resolution, an annual action that takes place. It is to assess the 2014 sidewalk, driveway, apron, and curb assessments. The second item that will be on the agenda, which is an annual resolution as well, is the resolution to authorize to advertise for bids. These are for materials, supplies, and services for 2015. And that's an annual bid as well, which affords the village certain savings in undertaking certain work and obtaining certain materials. The final item for discussion this evening, we would like to bring forth a resolution with respect to professional services. This is an item that the village board had spoken about previously. It involves a Mind Mixer. They are an organization, an entity that facilitates public input and public comment on ongoing projects and discussions that take place within the village. And the resolution will authorize the village manager to sign an agreement with them for a period of years so that they can be engaged and we can begin the process of actually reviewing individual issues that are before and of concern not only to the village board but also to the public. So Christina, I'm going to read that resolution.
Okay, a resolution this evening for professional services, Mind Mixer, authorization to execute agreement. Resolved that the village manager of the Village of Ossining is hereby authorized to execute an agreement with a 4-year term for a total amount not to exceed $9,800 with Social Mentum LLC, Mind Mixer, 1735 Baltimore Avenue, Kansas City, Missouri, for professional services involving all aspects of the Mind Mixer engagement platform, subject to the review and approval of said agreement by Corporation Council. Do I have a motion?
So moved.
Second.
Okay, motion is carried.
We should probably
We have to
vote.
vote on the motion. Yes.
On the board. Madam Interim Acting Clerk.
Motion is carried.
Oh, we still haven't said aye.
Oh, all in favor? Sorry.
Aye. Thank you.
Opposed?
I think I missed this in the, before when Richard went over a couple of things, one of which was the authorization for the bids, and also obviously the sidewalk assessment. I've been approached by a couple of people in the village asking about how they have their sidewalks repaired and redone. And if you want to have this done, it's a really great option because it's at a reduced cost. The village gets a great price to have your sidewalk redone. You have a couple of payment options, one of which is to pay when the work is complete. But you can also add it on your tax bill for next year, and it's broken out, obviously, whenever you pay your taxes, either through your mortgage bill or whatever. But if you want to have, if you want to have your sidewalk redone and have it done by the village, you can call the Department of Public Works, 914-941-4660, and you're going to get the lowest contracted rate to have that sidewalk work done. So I just wanted to mention that they're putting the list together now for the work that we've done in the spring and summertime.
Great, thank you, John. And Christina?
So, I think we need to close the special hearing now and go back into the work session. Special hearing.
Do we have a motion
Do we have a motion?
to close the special meet session to go back into our work session?
Motion.
So moved.
So,
Okay, all in favor?
Aye, okay. Thank you. It's official. Now we're in our green building guidelines work session. Thank you so much for joining us. I'll give a brief introduction of what to expect for the evening. And before I turn it over to Brad Tito, the Director of Sustainability for your office. Do I have your title correct, Brad? Okay. Several years ago, the village went through a very extensive process of putting together a comprehensive plan. And at the time, it was considered, do we want to have green building guidelines? And it wasn't quite time yet. But now, thanks to other municipalities, two of which are represented here on our panel, other municipalities have charted that path in different ways. And what we're doing tonight is just beginning the discussion in the village of how we might want to go about that in the village of Ossining. And so I'm very pleased to have with us here tonight Brad Tito, the Director of Sustainability for Yonkers, and Sharon Kivowitz, who was instrumental in putting together the green building approach in Hastings. And both of our guests are going to do presentations for all of us. Brad, do you want to get set up? And while you do, I'll just acknowledge some of the other folks that are in the room. Of course, we all know Richard Lyons, our village manager, and Laura Lee Dixon, our corporation counsel, and Christina Paves, our assistant village manager. But also with us tonight, We have some of our department heads who would be integrally involved if we were to implement green building guidelines. And we have Andy Teese, our superintendent of water, Paul Fraioli, our director of DPW and village engineer, and Al Scirocco, our building inspector, and Valerie Manastra, who was very helpful in putting together tonight's program. So thank you all very much for being here. So after Brad and Sharon give their presentations, folks in the village are going to have a chance to, who work for the village or who volunteer for the village are going to have a chance to ask some questions. And after that, we'll open up questions to anyone from the community who has joined us this evening that would like to learn more about how these communities have approached it as we consider how we may want to. So I'll also acknowledge Joanne Tall is the head of the Historic Preservation Commission, and Miguel Hernandez, who is also a part of the Historic Preservation Commission. Thank you so much for being with us. And Barbara Klapkowski, who is a member of our Village Planning Board, has joined us here this evening. So we're very pleased to have all of you here to help us make sense of where we're at. Are there any other volunteer board members that I have not acknowledged, or any other village employees that I should be acknowledging? Okay, good. All right, well then with that, I will stop talking and let Brad tell us about Yonkers.
Great. Well, hello, my name is Brad Tito. I'm the Director of Sustainability for the City of Yonkers. And on behalf of Mayor Mike Spano, thank you very much, Mayor Garrity, for inviting me. It's really great to be here in Ossining. I had the pleasure of serving with Mayor Garrity on the Sustainable Westchester Steering Committee, where we often spoke about how much more we could accomplish as government officials working together than we can trying to go it alone. So the 40-plus local government members of Sustainable Westchester have banded together and are looking to scale up the very best ideas for improving our communities. And it all starts with learning from each other at events like this. So again, I'm very happy to be here. Thank you. So today I'm going to talk about our green building program in Yonkers. But first, let me give you a little bit of background on Mayor Mike Spano's Yonkers Green City initiative. Now, Yonkers Green City is a community-led initiative where thousands of individuals, businesses, and government officials are making great progress building an even more healthy, vibrant, and attractive city. So city government is leading by example. We've unearthed a long-buried river. We're upgrading city buildings to make them more energy efficient. We've replaced all our streetlights with LEDs, installed smart water meters in over 20,000 homes and businesses. And there's really a great momentum building around sustainability in Yonkers. And the results are remarkable. City taxpayers are on track to save $20 million in energy costs over 10 years. We're cutting the carbon footprint of government operations by 12%. And that's not just the plan, that's all projects that are complete and installed. So the city's green building program is an important part of Yonkers Green City. So what exactly is green development? Well, we call it green building, green standards, or green development. It's all the same. It's new construction or renovation projects that protect the environment, create healthier, more comfortable buildings, and reduce strains on overburdened infrastructure. So it covers a wide range of issues spanning energy, environment, and health. So we've calculated the carbon footprint of Yonkers and found that 2/3 of our greenhouse gas emissions come from buildings. So for us, the takeaway here is that we can make dramatic progress on climate change, but only if we design our buildings to be more sustainable. And to address climate change, we need all levels of government, the private sector and the public, to engage in a coordinated and sustained effort. But Yonkers is a pretty unique place. It may not be the first thing that comes to your mind, but Yonkers is very much the city of the future. The green city others are striving to emulate. And it's not because of our green initiatives or our green building program. It's because Yonkers is one of the most densely populated cities in the United States. Half of our housing is in buildings with 5 or more units. And when people live in smaller apartments, they have less space to heat and cool, fewer light bulbs, there's less heat loss. So our building stock in Yonkers, it's very efficient. But we've also got a great transportation infrastructure. And Yonkers is compact. It's 6 miles top to bottom, 3.5 miles wide. You could walk clear across the city in about an hour. And because we have this density, and much of it is within walking distance of transit and services, Yonkers is extremely energy efficient. In fact, we use 1/3 less energy per capita than Seattle or Boston. Now let me ask you this. How many of you would agree that Portland, Oregon is one of the greenest cities in the United States? Show of hands. You know, it's kind of known for that. Well, in Yonkers, we use half as much electricity per capita as Portland. Half as much electricity per capita. So Yonkers makes for an interesting case study, and it may offer some important lessons as we try to scale up energy smart practices. So why should we embrace green building? Well, even if you don't believe in climate change, we almost all expect to see increases in future costs of energy, water, and waste disposal. They're some of the fastest growing line items in the Yonkers City budget. But to hold the line on taxes, we must use our resources more efficiently, cut costs, and avoid expensive infrastructure upgrades when we can. But perhaps most important, our communities will be successful to the extent that they're healthy, vibrant, and attractive places where people want to live and work. We think green buildings are an important part of what we need to attract the next generation of Yonkers residents. So if you're considering a green building program here in Ossining, you wouldn't be alone. According to the U.S. Green Building Council, there are literally hundreds of local, state, and federal green building initiatives, and programs vary widely. Some are voluntary, some are mandatory, some are incentive-based. There's lots of different approaches. Now, we've done what we think is right for Yonkers, but government officials need to strike the right balance for their own communities. So you're free to use our standards as a starting point and adapt the program as you see fit. So in Yonkers, our green building program was implemented in phases, starting in December of 2011, when the city approved a rezoning of much of our downtown. Now, this rezoning did a couple of things. It made the downtown a lot more attractive to developers. The city reduced its parking requirements, recognizing that most people in our downtown use public transit. A large mixed-use zone was created that allowed people to live and work in the same location. A form-based zoning code was adopted. And the result was that the development potential of our downtown was increased by over 3 million square feet. And to mitigate the environmental impact of this new development and to reduce strains it might place on the city's overburdened infrastructure, the city, along with our former council president, Chuck Lesnick, who's here with us today, enacted a requirement that any new construction or renovation projects in downtown must meet green building standards. So to understand how our green building standards came to be, we need to go back to 2009, when the Yonkers City Council passed legislation that required LEED certification. That's Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. It's a very well-known green building standard. The council passed legislation that required LEED certification for new private development in the city. But that legislation was vetoed by the prior administration on legal grounds. They said at the time that this legislation represented an illegal delegation of government authority. The reasoning goes that the city shouldn't approve or disapprove a development based on the decision of an outside group. In this case, it's the decision of the U.S. Green Building Council to certify a project. So our city attorneys and the Corporation Council, as well as the Pace University Land Use Law Center, recommended that the city choose Yonkers specific standards that would be enforced by our local building department. So soon after he took office in January of 2010, Mayor Spano convened the Yonkers Green Development Standards Work Group to develop a set of Yonkers-specific green building standards. Now, this work group consisted of city staff, building industry professionals, and leaders in the civic, environmental, and business communities. And the mayor laid out a few key criteria. The new standards must be measurable and effective, clear, flexible, enforceable, and reasonable. So the work group looked closely at a number of different standards, including LEED, the International Green Construction Code, Green Globes, and Enterprise Green Communities. And they ended up settling on and adapting the Enterprise Green Communities criteria. Now, this is a green building standard developed for the affordable housing sector by Enterprise Community Partners. And because Enterprise was for affordable housing, cost reduction was a major focus. So fees, commissioning, and other soft costs are much less with Enterprise. And studies show a slight increase in overall costs, but that this added cost is more than offset by utility savings over time. Enterprise has the added benefit of being very easy to understand and to use. So the work group started with Enterprise but made a number of important changes. The standards were expanded to include non-residential buildings, and they made it local. For example, the energy performance standards were made to align with NYSERDA grant programs. So if you built according to these standards, you'd be eligible for generous state incentives. In regard to stormwater, we gave points for green infrastructure elements which are listed in the New York State Stormwater Design Manual, like rain gardens and green roofs, which can be used to comply with state and local regulations. So it's really a set of standards that reflect the realities of building in Yonkers. And the final product was the Yonkers Green Development Workbook, which is available at yonkers.ny.gov/green standards. You can download it there and get a little bit more of the story behind it. So the standards are organized into major categories, including integrated design, location and neighborhood fabric, water conservation, energy efficiency, etc. And within each of those categories are a number of specific measures, some of which are mandatory while others can be incorporated to earn optional points. And compliance with the standards, it's achieved by integrating all mandatory measures into your project as well as achieving the requisite number of optional points based on the project scope. And for rehab projects, the standards only apply to what will be impacted by construction. So if you're changing out a toilet, it's got to be a low-flow toilet, but you don't have to start changing lights or add insulation to walls. If you're just doing the toilet, you just need to be concerned with the toilet. So here's an example of what you'll find in the workbook itself. Now this requires Energy Star appliances in all projects. And this one is pretty short. Others may be a page or two, but you can see that we've included a rationale, recommendations, requirements, and resources for each individual measure. So another key milestone in our program, in May of 2013, the mayor introduced and the city council unanimously approved the Yonkers Green Building Ordinance. And this legislation authorized the Commissioner of Planning and Development to officially adopt the city's green building standards. Now, this ordinance says that the new construction and major renovation in city-owned facilities and schools must comply with the city's green building standards. And this is significant because the city owns well over 100 city and school buildings, some of which are absolutely massive. In fact, the city spends $12 million in energy costs annually for its city and school buildings. So over time, green building standards and energy efficiency upgrades, these are really going to help to control the cost of government and keep our operating costs down. Now, the ordinance also says that private developers must submit a green development checklist with their site plan applications when they're proposing a new project. Now, this policy served as a critical real-world test of our green building standards. The checklist is required for non-residential development greater than 15,000 square feet, so commercial buildings greater than 15,000 square feet, and then residential development greater than 25 units. And this applies citywide. And the mayor has taken this a step further and required that all projects receiving city economic development incentives must also submit a checklist as part of their application. So it's important to note that under this ordinance, private developers submitting a completed checklist is the only requirement. Actual compliance with the standards is encouraged, but it's purely voluntary. But here's the thing. Real estate development is a high-stakes undertaking, and project approvals are critical to getting financing and to breaking ground. And if the developer wants everything to go smoothly in front of the planning board and the city council, at a minimum, their checklist is going to show compliance with the standards. Now, if the developer really wants to hit it out of the park, they're going to go and far exceed the requirements of the standards. And that's what I've seen with the dozens of checklists that we've received since the program was first implemented. It's important for the city to be able to say to the development community, this is what green means to us. That way, we're transparent and consistent, and the developer gets some certainty. Now, more than a year after the checklist requirement went into effect, the city saw that the policy was working. The point totals on the checklist we received suggested that the standards were very much achievable, and overall, we saw high levels of compliance. And once we saw that the standards had proven successful, the city moved to fully implement mandatory green building standards in downtown Yonkers. So in September of 2014, just a few months ago, the Commissioner of Planning and Development adopted an updated version of the standards that said that every construction project in the downtown, large or small, must be built green, except for those associated with 1- and 2-family homes. So the city hosted 3 information sessions to answer any questions from affected property owners. We sent out letters to everybody in that area. We did email blasts and press release. We really tried to get the word out about this change. But in terms of how we enforce mandatory green building requirements in downtown, compliance is a 2-step process, with step 1 occurring before the building permit is granted, and step 2 occurring after the construction end date. So in the first step, a building permit will not be issued without presenting a complete green development checklist that meets the requirements of the standards. That means projects must meet all applicable mandatory measures and achieve the requisite number of optional points for that construction type. And in the second step, after construction is complete, a certificate of occupancy will not be granted until a pre-occupancy compliance report is approved by the Department of Housing and Buildings describing how work was completed in conformance with the approved checklist. So it's being enforced by the city's building department. Now, it's still too early to draw any real conclusions, but there's no indication that development is coming to a screeching halt, like some of the developers claimed would happen. Quite the contrary. We're seeing real improvements in local economic conditions. Unemployment is at a 6-year low, home sales and sales prices are on the rise in Yonkers, and sales tax revenues are increasing as area residents support the local economy. So I'd like to conclude with just some key lessons from Yonkers. Whatever you do, lead by example. Adopt green standards for your own buildings. Look at ways to improve the performance of government operations more broadly. And open a dialogue. This event is a great start. The more points of view, the stronger your proposal will be. And make it local. Align your standards with New York State regulations and grant programs. Keep it simple and focus on ways it will improve quality of life and the economy. With that, I'll say thank you very much for having me. It's really a pleasure.
Thank you, Brad. Brad's going to stick around so that we can all ask questions, but right now we welcome to the stage Sharon Kowitz from Vws And Vh. Thank you so much, Sharon. And while Sharon's getting set up, I'll just take a moment to acknowledge his thank you, Chuck Lesnick, for joining us here, who was the very long-serving president of the Yonkers City Council and was intricately involved in many of the initiatives that Brad was just telling us about. And I would also like to acknowledge Jennifer Glass, who is with us. And Jennifer, I imagine tonight you're here in your capacity as a representative for the Village Environmental Advisory Council. Jen also works with Senator Carlucci's office, but not. Okay. And our village historian, Dana White, is joining us as well. Thank you so much for being with us. And Sharon?
I'm just trying to figure out how to just, do I go to slideshow? Oh, no. Hi, everyone. My name is Sharon Kibowitz, and I'm a member of the Hastings on Hudson Conservation Commission. I'm a volunteer in the village, and this Hastings on Hudson Green Building Code was in Hastings a purely volunteer effort, and I will explain that further as we go along. So why should we regulate the built environment? Brad talked about that a little. These are just some statistics from the U.S. Green Buildings Council. 39% of total energy use comes from the built environment, 65% of electricity consumption, 38% of greenhouse gas emissions, 30% of raw material use, 30% of waste output, and 12% of potable water consumption. So it's a pretty, these are huge statistics, and our village board and our mayor felt that we should be able to do something about this in Hastings. So they tasked the Conservation Commission, and I'll get into the process later, but we wanted to build a green building code that dovetailed with our other village codes. So it's an amendment to our village code. It does support our comprehensive plan and sustainability plan objectives, and it was included in our comprehensive plan. It establishes requirements for more sustainable, energy efficient building practices. It covers only those construction projects that require a building permit, including new construction and renovations. And it includes requirements for non-residential buildings as well as single and multi-family buildings and residential developments. And that was really critical in Hastings because we don't have a big commercial base or industrial base in Hastings, and this would have been a fruitless endeavor had we not included residential properties. So our code really plays itself out in the residential property sphere. I was asked to explain what our drafting process was, and as I said, the Mayor of Hastings and the Board of Trustees tasked the Conservation Commission with coordinating the effort to draft the Green Building Code, and I was the schmuck that they looked to do that. I was asked to lead the effort, and I proudly did. And initially, I did the preliminary footwork on figuring out what was out there in the country, what kinds of codes were out there, what sizes of municipalities and localities had passed green building codes, what was their building stock made of. And then once we kind of had a handle of what was out there, we convened a working group. We invited probably about 15 to 20 resident architects and builders who work in Hastings but don't necessarily live in Hastings, homeowners, and members of the Conservation Commission, members of our Board of Trustees, our mayor, and most importantly, our building inspector. And I will say this, our building inspector came to these first meetings eyes a-roll. And if he were sitting here, he has since retired, not because of our green building code. If he were sitting here, he would agree with me. He didn't want any part of this. And he left our biggest advocate. And so I have to give a lot of props to Devin Sharma, who you may know, who really was instrumental in making our green building code happen in Hastings. But I think having the building department and the building inspector on board and educated and involved in the process is probably the most important thing you can do if you want to develop a green building code for us. And I just want to diverge a little. We developed this initial working group, and we had several meetings with all these people. And we met with Ron Easter in New York State, and I can't remember the woman's name, from the IGCC. We met with LEED folks. We met with folks from Columbia University that had created a model code, and we looked at all these things and we realized none of this was going to work for us. For instance, the IGCC code didn't really apply to residential structures. It was too hard to tailor to residential structures. It would have been way too complicated for us. We're a small village. Energy Star only covers energy efficiency. I think Brad talked a lot about some of the issues with LEED and requiring third-party certification, some of the legal issues around that. And like I said, some of the other model codes that we looked at, they weren't comprehensive enough to meet our needs. So we decided to draft our own green building code in Hastings. And from our large working group, we brought it down to a smaller technical working group made up of architects from the larger group, the building inspector, me, some other members of our Conservation Commission. And it was in this group that we really wrote the code, every word of it, from scratch. We refined the scope, we identified specific provisions, we borrowed and stole from other codes, and we ultimately ended up with a draft code that was well-tailored for the needs of our small village. It then went to a review committee where we reviewed it and wrote some more. It then went to our planning board, who reviewed the draft and proposed changes to it. We redrafted based on planning board comments, and then we presented the code to our board of trustees and our village attorney and our mayor. We then went through another series of comments. We redrafted again. We held public hearings. I would like you to know that we had 2 public hearings and a public comment period, and we received minimal adverse comments. I mean, we were shocked. Actually, the first public hearing happened and nobody showed up. And it was felt that perhaps it wasn't well publicized enough, so we had a second public hearing and nobody really showed up again, other than to talk about how great the code will be. And the code passed. There was press, there was all the doomsday, predictions, developers were going to leave Hastings, nobody was going to ever, they were going to come, they were going to provide all this reasons why we shouldn't have this code. None of it happened. And we passed the code. And like I said at the bottom, this was an all-volunteer effort, including a volunteer effort on the part of our building inspector while he was required to be there. He spent many a Saturday, many an evening on his own time working on this code. And our building inspector was part of every single one of those committees. He was on the working group, he was on the technical working group, and he really wrote the code with a number of other people. This effort took us 3 years to complete. Hopefully it won't take you that long. But I think if you put some paid people on it, you might end up with a shorter time period. But as a volunteer effort, it took 3 years to complete. We had some guiding principles when drafting our code. It was based on best practices. We wanted it to be comprehensive, so we wanted it to cover not only energy consumption, but site planning, water usage, indoor air, recycling, everything. We wanted it to be clearly written, and we wanted everything to be in one place. We didn't want people to have to go searching through this standard and that standard to find, everything needs to be in one place. We wanted it to be a consultative process with the buildings department. So we granted our building inspector authority to grant waivers, and I'll go into that later. We didn't want it to cost the consumer significantly more money, and we had basically the Home Depot test. If you can get it in Home Depot, great. So the low VOC paints, if you could get it at the local Home Depot, then we would include it. If it was taking us a long time to find it, we didn't include it. Perhaps in our next iteration, as green building practices seep in, our code can become stricter, but we didn't want to do anything that would make it too difficult for folks to achieve compliance. Our code is broken into 3 parts. The first part just covers the intent of the code, its applicability, when we grant a waiver, appeals, and a fairly extensive definition section. The second part applies to non-residential buildings, multifamily residential buildings, and residential developments. And the third part applies to 1 and 2 family residential buildings and townhouses consisting of 3 or fewer units. And I will say, if you read our code, you'll wonder why did they break up parts 2 and 3, because they look essentially the same. They pretty much are essentially the same, with very minor exceptions. But so we have, like Brad was saying in Yonkers, we have mandatory provisions and we have additional provisions. So the mandatory provisions, and just quickly, these are the mandatory provisions, and I'll go into a little bit more detail in a minute. Proposal checklist, a natural resources study, site development, energy use, water, materials, and indoor environmental quality. So the proposal checklist, that has to be submitted with the building application, and like in Yonkers, it's basically a checklist that shows how you're going to comply with this code. And it has to be signed by the notary. We went back and forth on that a lot. Actually, that was a big comment people had. And we were insistent because we really felt that people take things much more seriously when they have to go and get something signed by in front of a notary. So, and that seems to be the case. And I've been told our current building inspector, our building inspector who worked on this code with us has since retired, and the new building inspector told me that this was by far the most invaluable provision that we could have included in the code. Because it gets everybody focused on the project from the first thought of the project. And we see our code as being as much an impacting the environment as also just educating the public, the professional community about green building standards. And by forcing them to focus in and go through the code in a very prescribed manner, the checklist really has made a big difference. So the first thing we require people to do is to do a natural resources study. And this is only applicable, not applicable to all projects, it's only applicable when your project includes new landscaping, new paving, it's going to impact stormwater quantity, and it's going to increase the building footprint. And the purpose behind this was really to get property owners and developers to think about the project in the context of their site and to tailor their plans accordingly. So, you know, we're having folks look at rock outcroppings and slopes and trees and various things like that. The next part of the code, of the mandatory provisions, looks at site development, and it covers protection and restoration of habitat, stormwater control, heat island, irrigation, landscape, bicycle racks and electric vehicle infrastructure for commercial properties, light trespass, and you're welcome to go dig deeper into the code or ask me specific questions when we get to it. The next part looks at energy utilization, and that covers exterior lighting, heating equipment, cooling equipment, and fixtures and appliances. And then energy use controls, and that covers electronic thermostats, whole building switches, and zoned heating and cooling. And when I called our building inspector to find out how the code was doing, how we were doing with the code, he did mention that the whole building switches, which only applies to new buildings or buildings where the renovations where the electric panel is being switched out, but that really is the one thing that he said is really giving people a lot of bellyache, and it's very expensive, and it doesn't add a whole lot to the project, and there's no requirement that it actually even be used once it's installed. So we are going to look at that provision and see if if we need to make a change. And then we look at the mandatory provisions include energy use monitoring, and that calls for an energy monitoring dashboard. And these are for big projects only, fundamental commissioning for, I think, 25,000 square feet or greater. So I don't even think we've had a project in the village yet that has to deal with We also look at water usage, and we call for low flow toilets and low flow showers. We look at materials and indoor environmental quality, and we require low VOC indoor paints, coatings, primers, and wood finishes, low VOC carpets and composites, the roofing materials, SRI, and it covers construction waste management and a certain amount of percentage of recycled materials. Then we have additional requirements. And the additional requirements, you have to achieve 5 points, and we have pages of ways that you can achieve 5 points. And the additional requirements only apply to new constructions, and as you can see, additions and alterations in excess of the lesser of 1,000 square feet or 50% of the bigger additions. And some of the additional points can be gotten: rainwater harvesting, waste management, I think upping the amount of recyclable material, putting in geothermal or solar heating or solar hot water, a green roof. Even the LED lights throughout the house will give you a point. So it's a whole bunch of ways to get at your 5 points. And then we have provided an opportunity for folks to suggest their own sustainability measures for a maximum of 3 points, subject to the approval of the building inspector. Everything I have just said is mandatory. If you need to get a building permit in the Village of Hastings, you must comply with this code. One of the biggest comments that people had trouble wrapping their brain around was, well, like you said, what if you're changing out your kitchen sink, or, then do you have to, does everything in the building have to comply? And no, I mean, it really only impacts the project that you're working on. And that, I think, once people understood that, I think that was part of the reason why fewer people came out to comment on the code. I think they realized it wasn't as onerous as they thought it was going to be. Like I said, our code does include exemptions, and it has an appeals process, and you can get an exemption for things such as hardship, infeasibility, or historical integrity. And if you apply for an exemption and the building inspector denies the exemption, then you have a right to appeal to the Board of Trustees. So how's it going? I was a little worried when I called the village to find out how is it going, because we have a new building inspector and he wasn't involved in the drafting, the development of the code. And I was so excited after I got home off the phone with him that I had to send an email to everybody on our committee and the mayor and all the trustees, because his reaction was so amazing. It made my week. I mean, and basically he said, it is going great. They've had very few complaints. The checklist, like I said, is very helpful. The contractors are getting used to the requirements. He gave me an example that, it was a big hassle at first to get 2 dumpsters, one for recycled material, one for trash, and now anybody knows that when they delivering a dumpster to Hastings, they're going to have to deliver 2, and it's just sort of become a part of doing business. Like I said, the whole house switch requirement may need to be deleted. We'll have to look at that. And basically his response was, I thought it would be a nightmare, but it's a piece of cake. So, and I have to end it there because I think that kind of says it all. But anyway, I won't end it. This is where you can find our code. I can provide that to you. And when I spoke to our building inspector, he said, he couldn't come this evening, but he said, by all means, have anybody, if you'd like to speak with him, he'd be more than happy to speak to anybody in the village of Ossining about his experience dealing with the code.
Thank you. Wow, thank you, Sharon. Thank you, Brad. That was a lot of information that we just took in. And I know that our building inspector, Al Scirocco, is chomping at the bit to start asking questions. But before we turn the mic over to Al, I wondered if any trustees wanted to kick us off with any initial questions, and then we'll open it up to other folks in the village.
I have a lot of questions, actually. This is actually great information. I think we are almost in between Yonkers and Hastings because we're not really a city. but we are bigger than Hastings as well, so we're kind of in the middle. Couple of things, and you mentioned this, this process started going on since 2014, officially, so to speak. How many projects has the building department have worked on the new process? Do you have a number, sort of an idea?
I don't have an exact number. I don't have an exact number, but I'd venture to guess that in terms of the number of building permit applications, it's probably in the dozens by now. And I've asked them about it, and a similar response to Hastings. It says it's very much achievable, so they don't run into a lot of resistance or problems. The biggest thing that comes up is that they don't know exactly how specific everything needs to be in the compliance report. But, all those issues get ironed out.
In regards to the force on the building department itself, did you have to have some sort of training? Because you mentioned a bunch of the green codes, and one of them is LEED. To work on a LEED project and anywhere else, like New York City, for example, you have to have some sort of certification. You have to have different exams that you need to take just to work on a LEED project. Is there anything that you guys have to do differently in the building department just to train the staff? Did you have to increase the staff number just to kind of make the workflow a lot easier than what it was before 2 years ago or 3 years ago?
Well, what our head building official has mentioned is the existing building code is very complex, and there's a lot that goes into it. Adding the contents of the green standards to his workload is really a small addition to what they're already doing. There has been the need to look through the book, and it's well written, so it's clear if a point is being awarded or if it's not being awarded. It states right in there exactly what's required. So a lot of it is just checking off to see that it was done, more than really requiring a lot of design expertise or special education. But we have hosted training events. We had the International Code Council come up from Washington, provide about 30 city staff and planning and building departments with a training on the International Green Construction Code. It was at that point we realized we definitely didn't want to go down that route because it's very complex. But it did give everybody sort of a sense of what green building strategies were and how they might apply to buildings in Yonkers.
I think in Hastings, Devin Sharma, who was our building inspector, was fairly knowledgeable about the building requirements. And so I don't know that he was necessarily LEED certified, but he had a lot of training. And so he was very knowledgeable and became far more knowledgeable through the drafting of this code and the process of doing that. I don't know that our new building inspector has been properly trained, but should be, and we'll raise that. But I do think that it is helpful to have some basic understanding of green building practices beyond just what your knowledge of construction is.
For right now, at least in my end, my last question, just give a chance. The other difference that I saw is in Hastings, one of the process to do is an online system that you guys have. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the system to do an application. Because I'm looking at right now online, and there's another portion where it says Green Building Code Application and Compliances Checklist. And it's pretty simple. It's only 2 pages.
If you look at the next document, it says Green Building Code Checklist, Part 2 and 3.
Correct.
So that's a little bit more
that's
comprehensive.
okay. And then you have but the other document itself, well, this is a 4-page document where it actually tells you the existing stuff. Okay. document itself for the green code, the Hastings has is only 21 pages. The one in Yonkers is 121 pages. So I think we might want to be in between. So, but for me, for now, that's it. Thank you very much. Thank you.
I don't know if I have any questions, but I think I wanted to thank you for coming, and I just wanted to say that I think the figures really speak for themselves. That I think all people who are in construction or doing new construction, have to see the benefit of not just reducing the carbon footprint, but just the energy savings and the whole quality of life that you're going to have for the people that are living in the buildings. So, and I agree with Manuel about, I think, my guess is that Hastings is a little closer to us in terms of the size and types of buildings. We're very densely settled here in Austin. In fact, probably as dense as Yonkers in some parts. So some of the things you've said really resonated in terms of the space that you have, the kinds of houses you have, the density, and all those other things. But thank you very much for coming, and I look forward to learning much more.
So what I got from all this is that it can be comprehensive yet achievable. I am very new to rebuilding codes, and even when I met our building inspector and our planner, I was like, guys, I understand how you guys do what you do. And as long as we're starting the first step now. So if we develop code and a system that we know is realistic and attainable with our own department heads and this board and our residents, then it's going to work. And it's great to see that in 2 communities it is working. So thank you.
As you can see, there's a lot of support for moving forward with this, at least among the elected. So I'll play Oprah and walk around with the mic. Is there anybody who works for the village or is on any of our boards that wants to kick us off with some more questions for our guests? Doesn't have to be Al, but it can be.
I really am new at this, and you're right, I was rolling my eyes. But question is about certifications. Of course, we're familiar with products and things that are brought through the applications, specifications, but you still need a certification because there's no way you're going to know if it was actually applied between paints and all these different items. Of course, we can check toilets and things like that, but when it comes to the overall checklist, the certification, is that what you had mentioned you did not?
I didn't mention it, and I should have. I'm sorry. The Hastings Code, there's a checklist, and then there are places in the code that you'll see that proof of this, that, or the other thing needs to be supplied to the building inspector. So before the building inspector, what occurs in Hastings, before the building inspector issues the C of O, he's going to want to see receipts, or whatever proof that you can have, tops of cans, or labels from the carpeting, or whatever can be shown can be shown. There is also certain. It was very hard in some respect, and you're bringing up the, in terms of the low VOC paints and coatings and carpets, it was very hard to find standards that were comprehensive and comprehensible. And as I said, we wanted this to be comprehensible to not only building professionals, but the homeowner who is about to embark on the project as well. So we did ultimately find some standards that we just decided, okay, this is the standard we're going to use. The South Coast, this board in California that looks at something like that. And they're scattered throughout our code. And we'll have to keep looking at this. I mean, we fully expect that it's an iterative process. And as the standard in the industry changes, we'll open it up and even more. So.
Yeah, and just quickly on certifications, the checklist is stamped by the registered design professional, as is the pre-occupancy compliance report. Then the inspectors go out and verify in the field, during their inspections that some of these things that were in the checklist were actually built. So that's essentially how it works.
Thank you.
All right, who's next?
For those of us that don't know, so that it's something that we can avoid, can you tell us what the whole building switch is?
I believe it's a switch that, but I can tell you exactly. It controls the all the electric output in the house, and it can go into like a sleep mode. And apparently, it adds a lot of money to the project, and it doesn't really get you a lot of bang. You don't have a lot of energy savings, is what I'm told by the building professionals who are dealing with it. And I'm trying to full building switch. And I'll just read to you from the code because I think it's the best. A master whole building switch must be installed to control applicable circuits and outlets, such as lights and major appliances, which can shift circuits to economy mode when the structure is not occupied. For residential projects subject to Part 2 requirements, a whole building switch shall be installed in each residential unit with respect to the projects identified for additions and alterations. It applies when only when a new main electric panel is installed. So it's like a sleep switch, it puts your coffee pod and your television and everything more in sleep mode. But I think you have to make that happen. There's no way to police that, and it's apparently thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars to do. So we're going to look at it. I'm not sure we're going to take it out, but we're going to look at it. We've been asked.
Yeah, our standard may be 120 pages, but there's no whole building switch.
This is Joanne Tall, who's the chair of our Historic Preservation Commission.
I have some questions and some comments. The first question is for both of you. How has this process affected your historic fabric of both your city and
Not at all. There's really no conflict. There's been a lot written about how sustainability and green building can work in conjunction with historic preservation. We believe that. We have a Landmarks Preservation Board that looks at historic structures and makes determinations, on the merits there. We really take pride in our historic buildings, and so we wouldn't want any kind of sustainability efforts to impede that. Yonkers City Hall, we've replaced all 500 windows. They look exactly like the original windows, but they are incredibly energy efficient, and it makes so much of a difference. I mean, we spend $250,000 on energy just for our City Hall building, and these windows are expected to save us tens of thousands of dollars. When you look at the building, it looks the same as it did before. So from that perspective, we think that there is no conflict.
Well, on that note, the new New York State Energy Code is the first one that does not exempt historic buildings. So, certainly there are technologies that allow historic buildings to be very energy efficient. And actually, we all know that the building that's already there is very green because the goods have been manufactured, they've been delivered, and they've been installed already. Also, just a general comment about this whole process. We all have to do this anyhow. I'm an architect, and the new energy code, phased out incandescent lights, and now they're going after fluorescence. We're going to be all LED in probably another decade, or some other technology. And I have a question for Brad. With developers that have gone through this process, is it hoping that the market for real estate is more into rental. Developers are making and building rental property in lieu of condos because they have to hang on to them. And to run them efficiently, they could make more money as a rental property.
You know, I actually would say almost the opposite, because if the owner is not the same as the person who's paying the electric bill, then it's not necessarily in their interest to make that upfront capital investment to improve the efficiency of that building. So with renters, you have this split incentive, and so maybe the only way to address that is by establishing these mandatory requirements. Because yes, if you're gonna, like the city pays its electric bill, and we foresee well into the future paying our electric bill, it's in our interest to invest in efficiency. That may not be the case with renters.
Okay, now, one more comment. I agree with Manny. We're somewhere between you and I. Admire the way that Hastings made it easy for the homeowner. Because as soon as you make something so difficult, it just is not going to happen. They won't renovate their house. They won't do this. They'll move out of the village. You know, there has to be an ease to it. And I totally understand a city not going after the single and two-family homes. And I understand Hastings going after that. And you put up there that percentage that buildings use 39% of the energy in this country. Well, the single and double family home, of that 39%, as I understand, uses across the country 80% of that 39%. So it's a big number. And but you know, that picture of Yonkers, you totally understand that you're mostly multifamily. So yeah, that's just a comment.
1/3 of our housing is single family.
What is the population of Hastings, Sharon? Do you know?
About 8,000.
About 8,000?
I will say this also, I think it is equally important in Hastings to include renovations and alterations because we're a built community. You know, there is not all that many, all that much space left for a brand new structure to be built. So I would encourage Austin, if you would take on this endeavor, to think about that. I mean, it's scary. People freak out. Oh, I'm moving my bathroom and making. But like I said, it hasn't turned out to be a good thing.
Thanks. Here we go, Valerie.
The checklist, do the checklists get submitted during the planning board process, or do they only get submitted during the building permit process?
In Hastings, it gets submitted when the building permit is submitted, application. But you're asking a good question, and I'm not sure I know the answer, but I can find it out for you and email you about that, because I guess if there's site approval, so I'm not really sure.
Yes, it gets submitted if it's over 15,000 square foot commercial, 25 units residential, it gets submitted in the site plan approval process. But the real kind of regulation of it happens at the building permit phase.
Okay, I don't see anybody from the village government itching to ask a question, so I'll open it up to, I'm going to get Mark Reisman just because he's here, but then I'm going to move over to Miguel Hernandez, who serves on our Historic Preservation Commission. Mark is also our town attorney. So. Deputy town attorney, the town, not the village.
Good evening. Just had a question for the city of Yonkers. When you talk about the requirement applying to commercial buildings that exceed 15,000 square feet, number one, would that be a building that is a total aggregate of 15,000 square feet, even if it's broken into smaller units? That's question number one. And question number two is what percentage of the commercial space is covered by that requirement in the city of Yonkers?
Good questions. Okay, so the 15,000 square feet is everything together. So that's one building, even if it's subleased. And then as far as what percentage of the commercial buildings are over 15,000 square feet, I don't know the answer to that question. I wouldn't even feel comfortable hazarding a guess.
I see the questions are starting to flow now. So Miguel Hernandez, did you want to ask a question? And then Paul Fraioli, our village engineer, will be next.
I was wondering what the term light trespass is, because my priest doesn't care for trespassing. No, only kidding. No, what is light trespass?
I think that light trespass has to do with lights from your building impacting someone else. So you have light pollution, you know, or just, yeah, that's what I believe it is. There's probably some, I'm not a building professional, so I learned a lot in this process, but I'm looking for it here, because everything's described in this code. Proper explanation. Yeah, it has to do with spillage upward or beyond the site boundaries. Must be prevented by using, and then there's these lighting zones. So you have to, if you're in a light zone 2, which is a low zone, which is primarily residential neighborhoods, then it tells you exactly what you need to do. If you're in a medium zone, commercial or industrial, then it tells you what you need to do. But it, yeah, has to do with your light spilling over into somebody else or impacting them.
Thank you. Paul?
Hello. For both communities, for the exempt applicants, is there any incentive offered other than just the concurrence that they realize the long-term future benefits that they're going to have? Is there any incentive that you offer them in addition to maybe an expedited building permit process, financial benefit, something of that nature?
No.
We don't really have any exempt applicants unless it's, you know, if you need a building permit in the village of Hastings, then you have to comply with this code. And we also don't have any incentives. We thought a lot about that, and we looked at other codes that did provide incentives, but we're just too small. We just don't have the budget for that.
Yep.
Or the years of waiting. I mean, it just doesn't exist in our code.
And if I could just add that, you know, this whole question of mandatory versus voluntary versus incentive-based, you know, when we really got into it, you know, we looked at, there were communities out there that gave tax credits and grants and incentives for green building. We just don't have the budget for that at all. You know, we couldn't afford it even if we wanted to do that. So the mandatory standards kind of creates an even playing field where everybody has to comply, everybody has to sort of absorb the same level of cost and inconvenience. So, you know, it was sort of, there's no incentives, but it seems fair, at least. So it worked for us.
Brett, did Yonkers take into account what some of the opportunities are through New York State that might make some of the mandatory or optional considerations favorable to developers, more affordable for them to take on?
Absolutely. Like I said, we aligned our standards to conform with all the requirements in NYSERDA programs. If you built according to our standards, you're eligible for very generous state incentives and grant programs, technical support, and other benefits that the state provides. So in that respect, you know, that's a benefit.
Okay. All right. We have another question back here.
I just want to say that one added benefit to the Green Buildings Code that hasn't come up is the safety components of laborers. These green building products are just safer materials. During construction, those paints and other plywoods and such, they wind up in your bloodstream, in your lungs, and it's the only thing that trumps budget is regulation. And in my industry, the workplace has become a much safer environment, much healthier workers that can work longer, more years in the business. So passing a regulation like this has an increased benefit to the laborers out there in the workforce.
Thank you. Marlene, did you have a question?
I did, actually. I was impressed with Yonkers' efforts with regard to their city hall, and I wondered, was that a capital project that you undertook through your budget, or did you find grant money and any help this community can find for grant money to do similar kinds of projects with?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question, because we actually replaced the city hall windows in conjunction with upgrades to 9 city buildings. And we did that with the New York Power Authority, who has a energy services program for local governments. So local governments that are NYPA customers are eligible to participate. And what they do is they provide a turnkey project to design and install these energy efficiency upgrades. They finance it with their very low cost of capital, and they put it on your electric bill as a special surcharge. So for us, we had the costs of the city hall windows were paid for about half with a federal grant. That was actually from the 2009 ERA funding, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. So about half of the funding for the city hall windows came from that. The other half was fully offset by energy savings achieved across the 9-building portfolio. So the net result was that we got new city hall windows, we got new color-changing LED lights on our city hall tower, we got literally thousands of new lighting fixtures throughout these 9 facilities, we've got new building management systems, and it's paying for itself, and it's delivering net cash to the city budget because those savings are exceeding our costs. And so it's a model that has really worked well for us, and we're looking at ramping it up to another 20 buildings, and it's something that perhaps would be something you can look at for buildings in Muncie, if you haven't already.
We are actually in the process of looking at energy efficiency upgrades in this thing, as well as LED streetlights, and you have a great story to tell on that too. We're not even going to get into tonight in Yonkers. Beyond the cost savings that you'll get from energy efficiency upgrades in your own municipally owned properties, have you been able to measure any savings that the community can recognize overall if these practices are implemented widely? For example, stormwater management comes to mind, and I'm sure there's others that you've considered in the process. Is this something that's been quantifiable for you yet?
Not yet for us. Like I said, we're very small. I don't even know if we've had one major project go through this whole process from beginning to end. But we're hoping at some point down the line that we will be able to.
In Yonkers, the city government, we spend $12 million on energy a year. Collectively, throughout all of Yonkers, we spend $500 million on energy every year. So if we can lead by example and show that these kinds of energy efficiency upgrades make sense to the bottom line, if other businesses and commercial owners and others take our lead, we're going to see savings. But it doesn't stop at energy. It's also in water. We've just started replacing all 30,000 water meters with these smart water meters. People are going to start actually responding to their actual usage rather than an estimated bill. And they're going to realize if there's a leak in the sprinklers out back, they're going to be able to fix that. We're actually going to be able to alert them. Domino Sugar, which is the largest water user in Yonkers, after we replaced their big main water meter, they invested in a water management software package that has allowed them to reduce their water use by 200,000 gallons a day. You know, they supply 6% of the sugar used throughout the country. You know, so it's those types of examples that show that this can get scaled up and make a big impact. It's not just kind of small potatoes in the government.
Thank you. Well, we have time for one or two more questions. If there's anybody else who has a question before we thank our guests. Yep, okay. Manny started us all off. Go right ahead, Manny. Trustee Assad.
Thank you. So I guess the last question that I have for tonight, Hastings said that all this work was done by voluntary people, so pretty much didn't cost anything at the end of the day. What about Yonkers? What happened there?
So I was also funded as a consultant through the ERA funding in 2009, and after this change in administration, they brought me on as a permanent employee. So yeah, I'm an employee of the city of Yonkers, and I helped to orchestrate the whole process. But the work group is all volunteers, and they really did the hard work of selecting the standards and putting it all together. It's like you have to have efficient meetings. You can't just keep this open-ended. You really have to have like a manager to run this thing so that in 5 meetings you have a deliverable. It just doesn't go on forever. So I don't want to say that we didn't spend money to make it work. It was a priority to invest in sustainability when the mayor came in, and he made that a commitment, and that was something that he saw through to the end. You can't overstate the benefits of having dedicated staff working on sustainability. Although there are great volunteer resources to tap, take advantage of.
I just want to, I can't agree with Brad more about you need to designate a single individual who will keep this project moving. For all groups working, and but there has to be. I kept the project moving. I basically wrote the draft of the code. With I'm not a technical expert. I'm a lawyer with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, so I know something about codes, but I don't know anything about green building. I'm not an architect. I'm not a builder. I've never even renovated my home. So but I learned a lot in the process. But I think it's crucial that you have somebody that is willing to take this on and lead the charge and corral everybody and make them sit at their meetings and turn around drafts, because otherwise it won't happen. This effort actually started in the village of Hastings several years before I was asked to do it, and because no individual was asked, the planning board was asked, it just never happened. And it really was because I was specifically asked, sat down at brunch with our mayor and said,
Okay, brunch, good idea. We have about 4 minutes before the tape's going to run out. So I would like to thank everyone who was part of this discussion today. This is the first step in the village exploring what the process might be if we want to move this forward. And if we've learned nothing else today, that there is quite a process ahead of us. And we are so grateful to be learning from your experience. So with that, I would like to offer either of you or both of you, if you will have one last comment or piece of advice you'd like to offer us as we're beginning this journey.
We've done a lot of the work on looking at standards, figuring out what's good. You can take between our two just those provisions that you like and get hit the ground running. So don't feel overwhelmed that you've got this huge extensive process ahead of you. You'd be surprised by how much consensus you'll build. That okay, this is definitely a part of it. This is definitely a part of it. This we're not so sure about. I bet you could put only 2% of it aside as controversial issues. The rest you could probably agree with, your colleagues.
I think that's really good advice, and play dries away, really. I mean, we did the hard work, and you should use it and run with it. Definitely need to tailor it to your specific needs in your village, but somewhere we'll find that.
Well, thank you all very much for joining us for this very special work session discussing green building codes. It's January 28th. Thank you. Join us next week, February 4th, at the courthouse at 8688 Spring Street for our regular meeting. Thank you very much.